There's a place in the Pokémon world that feels different from everywhere else. A town where the music changes, where the atmosphere grows heavy, where even the colors seem muted and strange. If you played Pokémon Red, Blue, or Yellow back in the late 90s, you remember it. You remember walking into Lavender Town for the first time and feeling something shift. The cheerful adventure you'd been on suddenly took a darker turn. The music became unsettling. The dialogue grew somber, and at the center of it all stood a tower filled with the spirits of departed Pokémon. Tonight, we're going to explore what really happened in Lavender Town. Not just the urban legends and creepypastas that spread across the internet years later, but the actual design choices, the cultural context, and the psychological elements that made this location so memorable and so disturbing to an entire generation of players. We'll look at the evidence hidden in the game itself, examine the theories that emerged from the community, and try to understand why this small town in a children's game about collecting cute monsters became the subject of one of gaming's most persistent mysteries. So, settle in and get comfortable, and let's take a slow walk through the fog-shrouded streets of Lavender Town. Let's uncover what the developers intended, what players experienced, and what might have been lost in translation between the Japanese original and the versions that reached the rest of the world. This is a story about game design, about cultural differences, about the power of music and atmosphere, and about how sometimes the most effective horror comes from the things we don't fully understand. When you first arrive in Lavender Town, you're coming from the bright, bustling streets of Celadon City, or the coastal routes near Vermilion. You've been battling trainers, collecting badges, filling your Pokédex with new creatures. The game has established a rhythm. You know what to expect. Towns are safe places where you heal your Pokémon, shop for supplies, and talk to friendly NPCs who give you tips and items. Gyms are where you face challenges. Routes are where you encounter wild Pokémon and rival trainers. Everything has its place in the structure of the game, but Lavender Town breaks that structure. The moment you cross into its boundaries, the familiar Pokémon Town theme is replaced by something else entirely. A high-pitched, dissonant melody that sounds like it's being played on a toy piano or music box. The notes are simple, almost childlike, but there's something wrong about them. They don't resolve the way you expect. The harmony feels off-center, and underneath it all, there's a binaural beat effect that creates an unsettling sense of movement in your ears, especially if you're playing with headphones. The town itself is small, just a few buildings, a Pokémon Center, a shop, a house, where an old man talks about the Pokémon Tower, and the tower itself looming over everything, 7 stories tall, filled with graves and ghosts. There's no jeep here, no major quest objective that you can immediately complete. Instead, you're presented with a mystery. Why can't you identify the ghost Pokémon that appear in the tower? What happened to Mr. Fuji, the kind old man who's supposedly trapped on the top floor? And why does everyone in town speak in hushed, reverent tones about death and loss? Let's start with the music, because that's where most people's memories of Lavender Town begin. The Lavender Town theme is one of the most recognizable pieces of music in video game history, and it's recognizable specifically because it makes people uncomfortable. Junichi Masuda, who composed the music for the original Pokémon games, created something that was intentionally different from every other town theme in the game. Where other locations had upbeat, major key melodies that conveyed safety and adventure, Lavender Town's theme was minor key, sparse, and deliberately unsettling. The composition uses a very limited range of notes, mostly in the higher registers of the Game Boy's sound chip. This creates a tinny, almost painful quality, especially on the original hardware with its small speaker. The melody repeats in a way that feels hypnotic, but never quite resolves into something comfortable. It's the musical equivalent of a question that never gets answered. And there's a rhythmic element that creates what's called a binaural beat effect, where slightly different frequencies in each ear create the perception of a third tone that exists only in your brain. Now, here's where the theories start to emerge. In the early 2000s, stories began circulating online about the original Japanese version of Pokémon Red and Green. According to these stories, the Lavender Town music in the Japanese release contained frequencies that were dangerous to children. The claims varied. Some said the music caused headaches and nausea. Others claimed it led to behavioral changes. The most extreme versions of the story alleged that the music had caused a wave of suicides among Japanese children in the months after the game's release, and that Nintendo had quietly altered the music in later versions and international releases to remove the harmful frequencies. These stories became known collectively as the Lavender Town Syndrome, and they spread rapidly through gaming forums and creepypasta websites. They were compelling because they contained just enough technical detail to sound plausible. They referenced real concepts like binaural beats and infrasound. They provided specific numbers, claiming that certain frequencies between 800 and 1,000 hertz were particularly dangerous to children whose ear canals were still developing, and they pointed to the fact that the music was indeed changed between the Japanese and international releases, which seemed to support the idea that something had been wrong with the original. But let's separate fact from fiction here, because this is important for understanding what really happened. It's true that the Lavender Town music was modified between the Japanese red and green versions and the later releases. If you listen to them side by side, you can hear the differences. The Japanese version has a slightly higher pitch and a more pronounced binaural effect. The international versions and the later Japanese blue version have a somewhat softer, less harsh sound. This change is documented and verifiable. What's not true is the claim about mass suicides or widespread illness. There are no credible reports of any such incidents in Japanese media from that time period. No hospital records, no news articles, no official statements from Nintendo or Game Freak acknowledging a problem. The story appears to have originated entirely from internet fiction, specifically from creepypasta communities that specialized in creating elaborate horror stories based on video games. The Lavender Town Syndrome was a work of collaborative fiction that became so widely shared that many people began to believe it was real. However, and this is crucial, the fact that the extreme claims were false doesn't mean the music had no effect on players. Many people who played the original games as children report that the Lavender Town music made them genuinely uncomfortable. Some experienced headaches or felt nauseated. Others simply found it so unpleasant that they rushed through the town as quickly as possible or played with the sound off. These reactions were real, even if they weren't part of some conspiracy or cover-up. The reason the music affected people has to do with how our brains process sound and how the Game Boy's audio hardware worked. The Game Boy had 4 sound channels, and composers had to work within very strict limitations. High-frequency sounds were often used because they cut through the small speaker more clearly, but those same high frequencies can be fatiguing to listen to, especially for extended periods. The binaural effect created by having slightly different tones in each ear can cause a sense of disorientation or unease, and the repetitive, unresolved melody creates a psychological tension that never releases. Junichi Masuda knew what he was doing. In interviews, he's talked about how he wanted Lavender Town to feel different, to create a sense of unease and melancholy. The music was meant to make you uncomfortable. It was meant to signal that this place was not like the other towns you'd visited. And it worked, perhaps more effectively than anyone anticipated. The music became so associated with discomfort and unease that it took on a life of its own in gaming culture, spawning countless remixes, analyses, and horror stories. But the music is only part of what makes Lavender Town disturbing. Let's talk about the tower itself and what it represents. The Pokémon Tower is a 7-story structure dedicated to the graves of deceased Pokémon. This is the first time in the game that death is addressed directly and seriously. Up until this point, when your Pokémon faint in battle, they're just knocked out. You take them to a Pokémon Center, they're healed, and everything's fine. The game has carefully avoided any suggestion that Pokémon can actually die. But in Lavender Town, death is unavoidable. The tower is full of graves. NPCs talk about their departed Pokémon with genuine grief. There's a woman on one of the floors who asks if you believe in ghosts, and when you answer, she responds with a chilling message about the spirits of Pokémon who weren't treated well by their trainers. The implication is clear. Pokémon can die, and when they do, their spirits may linger, especially if they died unhappy or were mistreated. This was heavy stuff for a game aimed at children. Pokémon was marketed as a fun, light-hearted adventure about friendship and collecting. The anime reinforced this tone with its episodic adventures and happy endings. But the games, particularly the original Red, Blue, and Yellow, had darker undercurrents that the anime often glossed over. Lavender Town was where those undercurrents surfaced most explicitly. The tower itself is structured like a traditional Japanese Buddhist pagoda, and this is where cultural context becomes important. In Japan, death and the honoring of the deceased are handled differently than in many Western cultures. Buddhist traditions include specific practices for mourning pets and animals. There are actual pet cemeteries and memorial services. The idea of a tower dedicated to departed Pokémon would resonate differently with a Japanese audience, who might see it as a natural extension of real-world practices, than with Western players encountering it without that cultural framework. The ghost Pokémon you encounter in the tower are another interesting element. When you first enter, you're confronted by what appears to be a ghost, but your Pokédex can't identify it. The game simply tells you that a ghost appeared, and you can't catch it or damage it with normal attacks. This is frustrating from a gameplay perspective, but it's brilliant from a narrative one. You're being told in no uncertain terms that your usual tools and strategies don't work here. You're out of your depth. You need something you don't have yet. That something turns out to be the Sylph Scope, an item you obtain after dealing with Team Rocket in Celadon City. Once you have the scope, you can return to the tower and identify the ghosts as actual Pokémon species, mostly Ghastly, Haunter, and the occasional Cubone. But there's one ghost that remains different. On the top floor, before you can rescue Mr. Fuji, you're confronted by the ghost of a Marowak, a Pokémon that was killed by Team Rocket while defending its baby Cubone. This encounter is significant for several reasons. First, it's the only time in the original games where you're explicitly told that a specific Pokémon was killed by human actions, not fainted, not knocked out, but killed. Second, you can't catch this ghost, even with the Sylph Scope. Even after you defeat it in battle, it doesn't go into a Pokeball. It simply disappears, its spirit finally at rest. The game is telling you that some things can't be collected or owned. Some losses are permanent. The Cubone and Marowak storyline is one of the most tragic elements in Pokémon lore. According to the Pokédex entries, Cubone wears the skull of its dead mother as a helmet and cries at night when it remembers her. Marowak is the evolved form, a Cubone that has grown stronger through its grief. The ghost Marowak in Pokémon Tower is implied to be the mother of the Cubone you can find in the wild in the area, creating a direct connection between the gameplay and the narrative tragedy. There's a theory that's been discussed extensively in the Pokémon community about the true nature of Cubone and its relationship to Kangaskhan. The theory suggests that Cubone is actually an orphaned Kangaskhan baby. If you look at the sprites, there are similarities in body shape and coloring. Kangaskhan is always depicted with a baby in its pouch, but you never encounter a baby Kangaskhan in the wild. The theory proposes that when a Kangaskhan dies, its baby takes its mother's skull and becomes a Cubone, explaining both the skull helmet and the Pokédex entries about mourning. This theory has never been officially confirmed, but it's supported by several pieces of circumstantial evidence. In the original games, there's an NPC in Lavender Town who mentions that Cubone are orphans. The Pokédex entries consistently emphasize Cubone's connection to its dead mother, and in later games, there are hints and references that seem to acknowledge the theory without explicitly confirming it. Whether intentional or not, the connection between Cubone, Marowak, and the theme of loss and mourning is central to the Lavender Town experience. Let's talk about Mr. Fuji, the old man you rescue from the top of the tower. He's presented as a kind, gentle person who cares for orphaned and abandoned Pokémon. After you save him, he returns to his house and gives you a Poké-flute, thanking you for your help. He seems like a straightforward, good guy character, a reward for completing the tower quest. But there are hints in the game that suggest there's more to his story. In the original Japanese version, there are references that were altered or removed in the English translation. Some Pihis mention that Mr. Fuji used to be a scientist. There are connections implied between him and the Cinnabar Island laboratory where Mewtwo was created. In later games, particularly Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green, these connections are made more explicit. Mr. Fuji is revealed to have been involved in the research that led to Mewtwo's creation, and his current life caring for Pokémon in Lavender Town is presented as a form of atonement. This adds a layer of complexity to the Lavender Town narrative. The kind old man isn't just a simple good character. He's someone with a past, someone who may have contributed to suffering and is now trying to make amends. The tower full of dead Pokémon takes on a different meaning when you consider that the person caring for it may have been involved in experiments that treated Pokémon as objects rather than living beings. It's a subtle form of storytelling that relies on players paying attention to small details and making connections across different parts of the game. The Cinnabar connection is important because it ties Lavender Town into the larger dark narrative running through the original Pokémon games. Cinnabar Island is where you find the abandoned laboratory, the journal entries describing the creation of Mewtwo, and the implications of genetic experimentation gone wrong. The Pokémon Mansion is full of burned buildings and feral Pokémon, suggesting some kind of catastrophe. And at the center of it all is Mewtwo, a Pokémon created through human ambition and scientific hubris, a being so powerful and so traumatized by its creation that it destroys the laboratory and everyone in it. If Mr. Fuji was part of that project, then his presence in Lavender Town takes on a different significance. He's surrounded by the graves of Pokémon, caring for the orphaned and abandoned, perhaps trying to atone for his role in creating a Pokémon that never should have existed. The game never states this explicitly, but the pieces are there for players who look closely enough. It's environmental storytelling at its finest, using location, dialogue, and implication to create a narrative that's darker and more complex than the surface level suggests. There's another character in Lavender Town who deserves attention. The little girl on the second floor of the tower, who asks if you believe in ghosts. Her dialogue changes depending on how you answer, but both responses are unsettling. If you say yes, she talks about how ghosts are real and they're all around you. If you say no, she suggests that maybe you'll change your mind after spending time in the tower. It's a small interaction, but it's memorable because it breaks the fourth wall slightly. She's not just talking about ghosts in the game world, she's talking about your experience as a player, about whether the game can make you believe in something you didn't believe before. This kind of metatextual element is rare in the original Pokémon games, which generally maintain a clear separation between the game world and the player's world. But Lavender Town blurs that line in subtle ways. The music affects you physically, creating real discomfort. The themes of death and loss resonate with real emotions, and characters like the ghost-believing girl seem to acknowledge that you, the player, are having an experience that goes beyond just playing a game. The channelers in the tower are another interesting element. These are trainers who use ghost and psychic-type Pokémon, and they're depicted as spiritual mediums who can communicate with the dead. Their dialogue often references the spirits in the tower and the importance of respecting the deceased. In the Japanese version, they're more explicitly connected to Buddhist practices and traditions around death and mourning. Some of this cultural context was lost or simplified in translation, but the core idea remains. These are people who exist in the space between the living and the dead, who can perceive and interact with spirits. Fighting trainers in a graveyard is itself a somewhat dark concept. You're essentially battling people in a place of mourning, disturbing the peace of the dead to progress through the tower. The game doesn't comment on this directly, but it creates an uncomfortable subtext. Are you being disrespectful? Are you any different from Team Rocket, who invaded the tower and killed the Marowak? The game leaves these questions unanswered, trusting players to grapple with the implications on their own. Let's examine the visual design of Lavender Town and the tower. The town itself uses a muted color palette, mostly grays and purples, in contrast to the brighter colors of other locations. The buildings are simple and sparse. There are no decorative elements, no flowers or trees, nothing that suggests life or growth. It's a town in mourning, and the visual design reinforces that at every turn. The tower's interior is even more stark. Gray walls, simple floors, rows of graves marked by small stones. The Game Boy's limited graphics actually work in the game's favor here, because the simplicity creates a sense of emptiness and desolation. There's nothing to distract you from the core experience of climbing through a building full of death. Later, remakes of the game added more visual detail, but many players feel that something was lost in the translation to more advanced hardware. The original's limitations created an atmosphere that's hard to replicate with better graphics. The ghost sprites themselves are deliberately ambiguous. Before you get the Sylph scope, the ghost appears as a white, amorphous shape with dark eyes. It's not clearly defined, which makes it more unsettling than if it were a detailed monster. Your brain fills in the gaps, and what you imagine is often scarier than what could be explicitly shown. Once you have the scope and can identify the ghosts as ghastly and haunter, they become less frightening because they're now known quantities, Pokémon you can understand and catch. This is a fundamental principle of horror. The unknown is scarier than the known. Lavender Town works because it introduces elements that don't fit into the established framework of the game. You can't identify the ghosts. You can't catch them. Your usual strategies don't work. You're forced to retreat and find a solution elsewhere. This creates genuine tension and uncertainty, emotions that are rare in a game that's otherwise fairly straightforward and predictable. There's a theory about why Lavender Town was included in the game at all, given how different it is from everything else. Some fans believe it was a deliberate attempt by the developers to add depth and maturity to what could have been a simple children's game. Pokémon was designed to appeal to kids, but the developers also wanted to create something that had layers that could be appreciated on different levels depending on the player's age and experience. Lavender Town serves as a reminder that the Pokémon world, despite its colorful exterior, has darkness and tragedy. Pokémon can die. People can be cruel. Loss is real and permanent. These are heavy themes, but they're presented in a way that's accessible to children while still being meaningful to older players. A child might rush through Lavender Town, uncomfortable but not deeply affected. An older player might pause and reflect on the implications, on what the tower represents, on the stories behind the graves. This multi-layered approach to storytelling is part of what made Pokémon so successful and enduring. It wasn't just a simple game about collecting monsters. It had depth and complexity hidden beneath the surface. Lavender Town was the most obvious example of this depth, but it wasn't the only one. The entire game is full of small details and implications that reward careful attention and thought. Let's consider the broader context of Japanese horror and how it influenced Lavender Town's design. Japanese horror, particularly in the 90s, had a distinctive style that emphasized atmosphere, suggestion, and psychological unease over explicit gore or jump scares. Films like Ringu and Ju-on created terror through slow-building dread, ambiguous threats, and the violation of safe spaces. Lavender Town draws from this tradition, creating horror through atmosphere and implication rather than explicit content. The idea of vengeful spirits, particularly spirits of those who die unjustly or unhappily, is central to Japanese ghost stories. The Marowak ghost fits this archetype perfectly. It was killed while defending its child, a tragic and unjust death. Its spirit lingers in the place where it died, unable to rest until its story is acknowledged and its child is safe. This is a classic Japanese ghost story structure, adapted into the context of a Pokémon game. The tower itself resembles traditional Japanese ghost story settings. Abandoned buildings, places of death, locations where the boundary between the living and dead is thin. The channelers serve as mediums, another common element in Japanese supernatural fiction. Even the music, with its dissonant, unresolved quality, echoes the soundtracks of Japanese horror films from that era. Lavender Town is, in many ways, a Japanese horror story embedded in a children's game, and understanding that cultural context helps explain why it's so effective. There's also something to be said about the timing of when players typically reach Lavender Town in their playthrough. By the time you arrive, you've been playing for several hours. You've established a rhythm and a comfort level with the game. You know how things work. You've bonded with your Pokémon team, and then suddenly you're confronted with death and loss and the possibility that your Pokémon could end up as graves in a tower. It's a jarring shift, and that's intentional. The game is challenging your assumptions and forcing you to think about the world you're playing in more seriously. Some players report that Lavender Town changed how they played the rest of the game. They became more careful with their Pokémon, more reluctant to let them faint in battle. They thought more about the implications of catching wild Pokémon and keeping them in boxes. The tower made the stakes feel real in a way they hadn't before. This is sophisticated game design, using a single location to reframe the entire experience and deepen the player's emotional investment. The connection between Lavender Town and Team Rocket is worth exploring in more detail. Team Rocket's presence in the tower, their killing of the Marowak, represents the game's clearest statement about the consequences of treating Pokémon as objects or tools. Team Rocket, throughout the game, is portrayed as viewing Pokémon purely as means to an end, as things to be stolen, sold, or exploited. The Marowak's death is the ultimate expression of this philosophy. A Pokémon killed simply because it was in the way. Your battle with Team Rocket in the tower takes on additional weight because of this context. You're not just fighting generic bad guys. You're confronting people who have committed what amounts to murder. The game doesn't use that word, but the implication is clear. And when you defeat them and they flee, there's no real justice. The Marowak is still dead. The Cubone is still orphaned. You've stopped Team Rocket from doing more harm in this specific instance, but you haven't undone the damage they've already caused. This moral complexity is unusual for a game of this era, especially one aimed at children. Usually, defeating the bad guys means everything is fixed and everyone is happy. But Lavender Town doesn't offer that satisfaction. You rescue Mr. Fuji, you lay the Marowak spirit to rest, but the fundamental tragedy remains. The tower is still full of graves. Pokémon are still dying. And Team Rocket is still out there, continuing their operations elsewhere. It's a more realistic and more sobering take on heroism and justice. There's a persistent rumor about a ghost in the original games that appears in unusual circumstances. According to the story, if you perform certain actions in a specific order, you can encounter a ghost sprite that isn't supposed to be in the game, sometimes called the buried alive ghost or the white hand sprite. This ghost supposedly appears in an unused area of the tower or in a glitched version of the location, and encountering it can cause the game to crash or behave strangely. Like the Lavender Town Syndrome story, this rumor has been thoroughly investigated by the gaming community. Data miners have examined the game's code extensively, and while there are unused sprites and data in the game files, there's no evidence of a buried alive ghost or any hidden encounter that matches the descriptions in the rumors. The story appears to be another piece of creepypasta fiction that became widely shared and believed. However, the persistence of these rumors tells us something important about Lavender Town's impact on players. The location was so unsettling, so different from the rest of the game, that people were willing to believe there were hidden horrors lurking in the code. The atmosphere created by the music, the visuals, and the narrative was so effective that it spawned an entire mythology of additional scares and secrets. Lavender Town became a focal point for gaming horror stories because it had already done the work of making players uncomfortable and uncertain. This phenomenon of players creating and sharing horror stories about games is interesting in its own right. It speaks to the power of interactive media to create lasting impressions and emotional responses. When you play a game, you're not just passively consuming a story. You're actively participating in it. Your choices and actions shape your experience. And when a game creates a strong emotional response, whether fear, sadness, or unease, that response becomes part of your personal history with the game. You remember how it made you feel, and you want to share that experience with others. Lavender Town became a shared cultural touchstone for a generation of Pokémon players. Almost everyone who played the original games has a memory of their first time in the town, of how the music made them feel, of the discomfort and unease. These shared memories created a community of people who understood the experience, who could reference it and know that others would immediately understand. And from that shared experience came the stories, the theories, the attempts to explain and expand on what made the location so memorable. Let's talk about how Lavender Town has been handled in later Pokémon games and remakes. When Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green were released for the Game Boy Advance, they included updated versions of all the locations from the original games, including Lavender Town. The music was remixed, keeping the core melody but adding more instrumentation and depth. The tower was redesigned with more detailed graphics, and some of the dialogue was expanded or clarified, particularly the connections between Mr. Fuji and the Cinnabar Laboratory. The remakes tried to preserve the atmosphere of the original, while updating it for new hardware and a new generation of players. The results were mixed. Some players felt that the new version captured the essence of what made Lavender Town special. Others argued that something was lost, that the limitations of the original Game Boy had actually contributed to the location's effectiveness, and that the more detailed graphics and fuller sound made it less unsettling rather than more. This is a common challenge in game remakes. How do you update something for modern audiences while preserving what made it special in the first place? Lavender Town is a particularly difficult case because so much of its impact came from the specific technical limitations and design choices of the original. The harsh, high-pitched music worked because of the Game Boy's sound chip. The simple, stark graphics worked because they left room for imagination. Adding more detail and polish risks diluting the very elements that made the location memorable. In Pokémon Gold, Silver, and Crystal, which take place 3 years after the events of Red, Blue, and Yellow, Lavender Town has changed significantly. The Pokémon Tower has been converted into a radio tower. The graves have been moved to a new location outside of town. The town itself has a different, less ominous atmosphere. This change is explained in-game as progress and modernization, but it also serves a narrative purpose. It shows that the world moves on, that even places of mourning eventually change and adapt. Some players were disappointed by this change, feeling that it diminished the impact of Lavender Town. Others saw it as a natural evolution, a way of showing that the Pokémon world is dynamic and not frozen in time. The Radio Tower storyline in Gold and Silver involves Team Rocket taking over the building, which creates an interesting parallel to their invasion of the original tower. The location has changed, but it's still a place where Team Rocket causes trouble, still a place where you have to intervene to set things right. The decision to change Lavender Town in the sequels also reflects a shift in the series' overall tone. Gold and Silver were designed to be more upbeat and optimistic than the original games. The darker elements were still present, but they were less prominent. Lavender Town's transformation from a place of death and mourning to a modern radio tower fits this shift. The series was moving away from some of its darker themes, at least in the main games. However, Lavender Town's legacy continued in other ways. Later games in the series included their own ghost-type focused locations, often with similar atmospheric elements. The old chateau in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, the strange house in Black 2 and White 2, the abandoned thrifty megamart in Sun and Moon. All of these locations draw inspiration from Lavender Town's approach to creating unease and discomfort through atmosphere and implication. The Pokémon series has also become more willing to address darker themes as it's evolved. Later games have included more explicit references to death, loss, and tragedy. The storyline in Pokémon Sun and Moon about Lily and her abusive mother, the post-game episode in X and Y dealing with the aftermath of the ancient weapon, the exploration of mortality and legacy in Legends Arceus. All of these show a series that's grown more comfortable with mature themes. And Lavender Town was arguably the first step in that direction. There's an interesting psychological aspect to why Lavender Town affected so many players so deeply. Children and young teenagers, the primary audience for Pokémon, are at a developmental stage where they're beginning to grapple with concepts like death and mortality. For many players, Lavender Town may have been one of their first exposures to these themes in media. The game presented death not as something abstract or distant, but as something that happened to creatures they cared about, in a world they were invested in. The Pokémon you catch and train aren't just game mechanics. They're characters you've bonded with. You've given them nicknames, used them in battles, watched them grow and evolve. The idea that they could die, that they could end up as graves in a tower, makes death personal and immediate in a way that's rare in children's media. Lavender Town forced young players to confront mortality in a context that mattered to them. And that's a powerful and potentially unsettling experience. There's also the element of helplessness. When you first enter the tower, you can't do anything about the ghosts. You can't catch them, you can't defeat them, you can't progress. You have to leave and come back later with the right tool. This creates a sense of powerlessness that's unusual in video games, where players are typically given agency and the ability to overcome obstacles through skill or persistence. Lavender Town takes that agency away temporarily, forcing you to acknowledge that some problems can't be solved immediately, that sometimes you have to retreat and find another approach. This lesson in delayed gratification and strategic thinking is valuable, but it's also frustrating and uncomfortable. Players don't like feeling powerless. They don't like being told they can't do something, and that discomfort adds to the overall unease of the location. You're not just uncomfortable because of the music and the themes. You're uncomfortable because the game has taken away your usual tools and strategies. The sound design, beyond just the main theme, deserves attention as well. The sound effects in Lavender Town are subtly different from other locations. The footstep sounds seem quieter, more muffled. The menu sounds are the same, but they feel more intrusive in the quiet atmosphere. And the cry of the ghost Pokémon, before you can identify them, is a distorted, unsettling sound that doesn't match any other Pokémon in the game. These small details add up to create an audio landscape that's distinctly uncomfortable. In the tower itself, there are moments of silence between encounters that feel longer than they should. The game's usual background music continues, but the spaces between notes seem to stretch out. This is likely just perception, the result of being on edge and paying more attention to the audio, but it contributes to the sense that time moves differently in Lavender Town, that the normal rules don't quite apply. There's a theory among some players that the Lavender Town experience was a test, a way for the developers to see how far they could push the boundaries of what was acceptable in a children's game. Pokémon was a massive success in Japan before it was released internationally, and the developers had some freedom to experiment. Lavender Town represented the darkest, most mature content in the game, and its inclusion was a gamble. Would parents object? Would children be too frightened? Would it hurt the game's reputation? As it turned out, the gamble paid off. While some parents and critics did express concern about the darker elements, the overall response was positive. Players appreciated the depth and complexity that Lavender Town added to the game. It became one of the most memorable and discussed locations in the entire series, and it demonstrated that children's media could address serious themes without being inappropriate or harmful, as long as it was done thoughtfully and with care. This success likely influenced the direction of the Pokémon series and children's games more broadly. It showed that young players could handle and even appreciate more mature content, that they didn't need to be shielded from every difficult topic. Lavender Town proved that you could create something that was both accessible to children and meaningful to older players, that you could have depth and complexity without sacrificing broad appeal. The legacy of Lavender Town extends beyond just the Pokémon series. It's influenced how other games approach atmosphere and horror, particularly in games aimed at younger audiences. The idea that you can create genuine unease and discomfort through music, visual design, and narrative implication without relying on explicit violence or gore has become a recognized technique in game design. Lavender Town is often cited as an example of effective atmospheric horror, studied by developers and designers looking to create similar experiences. The location has also become a cultural reference point beyond gaming. The Lavender Town music has been remixed and referenced in countless YouTube videos, music tracks, and internet memes. The phrase Lavender Town Syndrome is recognized even by people who've never played Pokémon as shorthand for the idea of media that affects people in unexpected or unsettling ways. The town has transcended its origins to become a piece of internet folklore, a shared cultural touchstone that represents a specific kind of gaming experience. Let's consider what Lavender Town means in the context of the complete Pokémon narrative. The game's story is ultimately about growth, friendship, and becoming a champion. You start as a young trainer leaving home for the first time, and you end as the Pokémon League champion, having defeated the strongest trainers in the region. It's a classic hero's journey, a coming-of-age story told through the mechanics of catching and battling creatures. Lavender Town represents a crucial moment in that journey. It's where you're forced to confront the reality that your adventure has stakes, that there are real consequences to the battles you fight and the world you're exploring. It's a moment of maturation, where the game asks you to think more deeply about what you're doing and why. and it's a test of your resolve. Will you push through the discomfort and unease to rescue Mr. Fuji and lay the Marowak spirit to rest, or will you avoid the town and leave the problem unsolved? Most players, of course, push through. They complete the tower, get the Poke Flute, and move on with their journey. But the experience stays with them. They remember how they felt in that moment, the discomfort and the unease, and it colors their perception of the rest of the game. They're more aware of the darker undercurrents, more attentive to the implications of what they're doing. Lavender Town changes how you see the Pokémon world, and that change is permanent. There's something profound about a children's game that's willing to do this, to create a moment that's genuinely uncomfortable and challenging, not just in terms of gameplay difficulty, but in terms of emotional and psychological impact. It shows a respect for the audience, a belief that children can handle complex emotions and difficult themes if they're presented appropriately. And it creates a more meaningful experience, one that resonates long after the game is finished. The Cubone storyline, which is so central to Lavender Town, has continued to resonate throughout the Pokémon series. Cubone and Marowak appear in later games, and their Pokédex entries consistently reference the theme of loss and mourning. In Pokémon Sun and Moon, there's a special Alolan form of Marowak that's a fire and ghost type, explicitly connecting it to the ghost Marowak from Lavender Tower. The game acknowledges the legacy of that encounter and builds on it, showing that the developers understand how important that storyline was to players. There are also references and callbacks to Lavender Town in other Pokémon media. The anime eventually did an episode set in Lavender Town, though it significantly toned down the darker elements to fit the show's lighter tone. The Pokémon Adventures manga, which is generally darker and more mature than the anime, included a Lavender Town arc that was closer in tone to the games, with explicit references to death and the supernatural. These adaptations show how the same basic story can be told in different ways for different audiences, but the core elements remain recognizable. The question of whether Lavender Town was too dark for a children's game is one that's been debated for years. Some argue that it was inappropriate, that it exposed children to themes they weren't ready for, that it caused genuine distress for some players. Others counter that it was handled appropriately, that it addressed serious themes in a way that was accessible and not gratuitously disturbing, and that it gave children credit for being able to handle complex emotions. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. For most players, Lavender Town was a memorable but not traumatic experience. It was unsettling, but in a way that added depth to the game rather than causing harm. For some players, particularly younger children or those who were more sensitive to scary content, it may have been genuinely frightening or distressing. And for a few, it became a formative experience, a moment that shaped how they thought about games and storytelling. What's clear is that Lavender Town succeeded in its goal of creating a distinct and memorable location that stood apart from the rest of the game. Whether you think it went too far or not far enough, whether you found it scary or just mildly unsettling, you remember it. And in a game full of memorable locations and moments, that's a significant achievement. The technical aspects of how Lavender Town was created are worth examining as well. The Game Boy was a severely limited platform with a tiny screen, a four-color palette, and minimal audio capabilities. Creating any kind of atmosphere or mood within these constraints was a challenge. The developers had to be creative and efficient, using every tool at their disposal to maximum effect. The music was composed using the Game Boy's 4 sound channels, 2 pulse wave channels, 1 wave channel, and 1 noise channel. Junichi Masuda used these channels to create the distinctive Lavender Town theme, with its high-pitched melody and unsettling harmonies. The binaural effect was achieved by having slightly different frequencies in the left and right audio channels, creating a sense of movement and disorientation. This was sophisticated audio design for the hardware, pushing the Game Boy's capabilities to create something genuinely affecting. The visual design worked within the Game Boy's 4-shade grayscale palette to create a sense of gloom and emptiness. The town uses mostly the darker shades, with minimal contrast, creating a muted, depressing atmosphere. The tower interior is even more stark, with simple repeating patterns that emphasize the emptiness and desolation. The ghost sprites use the lightest shade for their bodies and the darkest for their eyes, creating a high-contrast image that stands out against the gray backgrounds. These technical choices were born of necessity, but they resulted in a more effective design than might have been possible with more advanced hardware. The limitations forced the developers to be creative and to rely on suggestion and implication rather than explicit detail. And as we've discussed, what you imagine is often scarier than what can be shown directly. The pacing of the Lavender Town sequence is also carefully designed. You arrive in town, hear the unsettling music, talk to NPCs who speak in hushed tones about death and ghosts. You enter the tower and encounter ghosts you can't identify or catch. You're forced to leave and find the Sylph Scope, which requires completing a significant portion of the Team Rocket storyline in Celadon City. Then you return, now able to progress through the tower, fighting channelers and ghost Pokémon until you reach the top and confront the Marowak ghost. Finally, you rescue Mr. Fuji, receive the Poke Flute, and can leave the town behind. This structure creates a sense of escalation and resolution. The initial visit establishes the mystery and the unease. The forced departure creates frustration and anticipation. The return with the Sylph Scope provides a sense of empowerment and progress. And the final confrontation with the Marowak ghost and the rescue of Mr. Fuji provide emotional catharsis and closure. It's a complete narrative arc within the larger game, and it's paced to maximize impact. The placement of Lavender Town in the overall game progression is also significant. It comes roughly a third of the way through the game after you've established your team and your playstyle, but before you've reached the later, more challenging areas. It's positioned at a point where you're comfortable with the game's mechanics, but still open to new experiences and surprises. This timing maximizes the impact of the location's departure from the established norms. If Lavender Town had come earlier, Players might not have had time to establish expectations that could be subverted. If it had come later, players might have been too set in their ways, too focused on the in-game objectives to fully engage with the atmospheric and narrative elements. The developers chose the perfect moment to introduce this darker, more complex content, and that choice was crucial to its effectiveness. There's also something to be said about the contrast between Lavender Town and the locations immediately before and after it. You typically arrive from Celadon City, a bright, bustling metropolis full of shops and activity, or from the Roots near Vermilion City, with their sunny beaches and cheerful trainers. The shift to Lavender Town's gloom and quiet is jarring and immediate, and after you complete the tower and move on, you head to either Saffron City or Fuchsia City, both of which return to the game's more typical play and atmosphere. Lavender Town is an island of darkness in an otherwise bright and optimistic game, and that isolation makes it stand out even more. The community response to Lavender Town over the years has been fascinating to observe. In the immediate aftermath of the game's release, players shared their experiences and reactions, comparing notes on how the music made them feel and discussing the storyline. As the internet grew and gaming communities became more organized, Lavender Town became a frequent topic of discussion, analysis, and speculation. The creepypasta stories emerged in the early 2000s as internet horror fiction became popular. These stories took the genuine unease that players felt and amplified it into elaborate horror narratives. The Lavender Town Syndrome story, the Buried Alive Ghost, and various other tales spread rapidly through forums and websites. Some people believed them, others recognized them as fiction, but everyone engaged with them because they tapped into real memories and real emotions. As the years passed and more people studied the game's code and design, the factual basis for these stories was debunked. But the stories themselves remained popular, not as truth, but as a form of collaborative mythology. They represented the community's collective memory of how Lavender Town made them feel. Exaggerated and dramatized, but rooted in genuine experience. The stories became part of the location's legacy, inseparable from discussions of the actual game content. More recently, there's been a wave of analytical content examining Lavender Town from design, psychological, and cultural perspectives. Video essays, articles, and academic papers have explored why the location was so effective, what techniques the developers used, and what it reveals about game design and player psychology. Lavender Town has become a case study, an example used to illustrate principles of atmospheric design, horror in games, and the power of music and sound in creating emotional responses. This evolution from immediate player experience to internet mythology to academic analysis shows how a piece of game design can take on a life of its own, becoming more than just a location in a game and transforming into a cultural phenomenon. Lavender Town means different things to different people, but it remains relevant and discussed decades after the original game's release. Let's talk about the music one more time, because it really is central to the entire experience. The Lavender Town theme is less than a minute long, a simple melody that loops continuously while you're in the town. But that simplicity is deceptive. The melody is carefully constructed to create and maintain tension without ever resolving it. It's in a minor key, which immediately creates a sense of sadness or unease. The notes are mostly in the higher register, which can be physically uncomfortable to listen to for extended periods. And the rhythm is slightly off-kilter, not quite matching the steady beat you'd expect. The binaural effect created by having slightly different frequencies in each ear is particularly interesting. Binaural beats are a real phenomenon where the brain perceives a third tone that's the difference between the two frequencies being played. This can create various effects depending on the frequency difference, from relaxation to alertness to, in some cases, discomfort or disorientation. The Lavender Town music uses this effect subtly, creating a sense of unease that's hard to pin down or explain. Musicians and composers have analyzed the Lavender Town theme extensively, breaking down its structure and explaining why it works so effectively. The melody uses intervals that are slightly dissonant, creating tension that never fully resolves. The harmony, such as it is with the Game Boy's limited channels, reinforces this tension rather than providing relief. And the repetitive nature of the loop means that this tension is maintained indefinitely, never building to a climax or releasing into something more comfortable. This is sophisticated composition, especially given the constraints of the hardware. Junichi Masuda created something that's musically interesting and emotionally effective using just a few simple tools. The Lavender Town theme has been covered and remixed countless times by musicians working in every genre imaginable, and it remains recognizable and unsettling in almost every version. That's a testament to the strength of the original composition. The contrast between the Lavender Town theme and the other town themes in the game is stark. Pallet Town's theme is gentle and nostalgic, evoking home and safety. Viridian City's theme is upbeat and adventurous, suggesting the journey ahead. Cerulean City's theme is bright and cheerful, with a bouncy rhythm. Lavender Town's theme is none of these things. It's somber, unsettling, and deliberately uncomfortable. It signals immediately that this place is different, that the normal rules don't apply here. This use of music to establish atmosphere and mood is something that games have continued to develop and refine over the years. But Lavender Town remains one of the most effective examples, a case where the music is inseparable from the location and the experience. You can't think about Lavender Town without hearing that theme in your head, and you can't hear that theme without remembering how it made you feel. As we near the end of this exploration, it's worth considering what Lavender Town represents in the broader context of gaming history. It's an example of how even within the constraints of limited hardware and a game aimed at children, developers can create something genuinely affecting and memorable. It shows that atmosphere and mood can be as important as gameplay mechanics or graphics, and it demonstrates that players, even young players, are capable of engaging with complex themes and emotions if they're presented thoughtfully. Lavender Town has influenced countless games that came after it. Anytime a game uses music and atmosphere to create unease, anytime a children's game addresses themes of loss or mortality, Anytime a location is designed to make players uncomfortable rather than entertained, there's a lineage that traces back to that small town in Pokémon Red and Blue. The developers of those later games may not have been directly inspired by Lavender Town, but they're working in a tradition that it helped establish. The location also represents a moment of trust between developers and players. The creators of Pokémon trusted that their audience could handle something darker and more complex than the typical children's game content. They trusted that players would engage with the themes rather than being simply frightened or put off. And they trusted that the experience would enhance rather than detract from the overall game. That trust was rewarded, and it paved the way for more ambitious and mature content in games aimed at younger audiences. Looking back now, more than 25 years after Pokémon Red and Blue were first released, Lavender Town remains a touchstone for discussions about game design, atmosphere, and the power of interactive media to create lasting emotional impressions. It's been analyzed, mythologized, remixed, and referenced countless times. It's inspired horror stories, academic papers, musical compositions, and endless forum discussions. And it continues to be one of the first things people mention when they talk about their memories of playing Pokémon as children. The fact that a single location in a Game Boy game from 1996 can still generate this much discussion and analysis is remarkable. It speaks to the effectiveness of the design, the resonance of the themes, and the lasting impact of the experience. Lavender Town succeeded in creating something that transcended its technical limitations and its context as part of a children's game, becoming instead a piece of gaming culture that continues to be relevant and meaningful decades later. So, what really happened in Lavender Town? On one level, the answer is simple. The developers created a location that addressed themes of death and loss, used music and visual design to create an unsettling atmosphere, and told a story about a ghost Pokémon and the people who mourn the departed. They pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in a children's game and created something that was genuinely affecting and memorable. On another level, what happened in Lavender Town is more complex and personal. Each player who visited that town had their own experience, their own emotional response, their own memories of how it made them feel. For some, it was a brief moment of discomfort in an otherwise enjoyable game. For others, it was a formative experience that shaped how they thought about games and storytelling. And for a few, it became something more, a source of fascination and analysis that they've returned to again and again over the years. The myths and legends that grew up around Lavender Town, the stories about dangerous frequencies and hidden ghosts, are part of what happened there too. They're not factually true, but they're emotionally true, representing the collective memory of a community of players who were genuinely unsettled by their experience. The stories are an attempt to explain and make sense of those feelings, to give them a narrative structure and a reason for existing. What happened in Lavender Town is that a group of talented developers created something that resonated far beyond what they probably intended or expected. They made a location that was supposed to be a brief detour in a larger adventure, a moment of darkness in an otherwise bright game. But they made it so effectively, with such attention to music and atmosphere and narrative that it became something more. It became a cultural phenomenon, a shared experience, a piece of gaming history that continues to be discussed and analyzed decades later. And perhaps most importantly, what happened in Lavender Town is that it showed what games could be. It demonstrated that interactive media could create genuine emotional responses, that it could address serious themes, that it could be art as well as entertainment. It proved that players were willing to engage with complex and challenging content, that they valued depth and meaning alongside fun and gameplay. Lavender Town was a statement about the potential of games as a medium, and that statement has been heard and built upon by countless developers in the years since. As you think about Lavender Town now, whether you're remembering your own experience playing the game or learning about it for the first time through this exploration, consider what it represents. It's a ghost town in a children's game, yes, but it's also a piece of design that pushed boundaries and took risks. It's a location that made players uncomfortable, but in doing so, it made them think and feel more deeply. It's a moment in gaming history that showed what was possible when developers trusted their audience and were willing to try something different. The tower still stands in the game, full of graves and ghosts. The music still plays, unsettling and unresolved. The story of the Marowak and its orphaned Cubone still resonates with players who encounter it. And Lavender Town remains a small location in an old game that somehow became something much larger, a cultural touchstone and a reminder of the power of thoughtful, ambitious game design. So the next time you hear that distinctive melody or see a reference to Lavender Town in another game or piece of media, remember what it represents. Remember the risks the developers took, the trust they placed in their audience, and the lasting impact of their work. Remember that sometimes the most memorable experiences come from the moments that make us uncomfortable, that challenge us, that force us to think about things we might prefer to avoid. And remember that even in a game about collecting cute monsters and becoming a champion, there's room for darkness, for loss, for genuine emotion and meaning. That's what really happened in Lavender Town. Not a conspiracy or a cover-up, not hidden frequencies or dangerous code, but something more profound and more lasting. A moment of genuine artistic achievement in an unexpected place. A piece of game design that transcended its medium and became part of our collective cultural memory. And that, perhaps, is the most remarkable thing of all.